I never thought a simple fence could start a chain reaction that would completely upend my life, but that's exactly what happened the morning the HOA came onto my property and tore mine down. I had spent months repairing it, making sure it could withstand anything. Storms, deer, even the occasional neighborhood dog. But apparently, none of that mattered. When I woke up that day, I thought I was going to deal with a minor property dispute. Instead, I walked outside to see a group of uniformed HOA enforcers ripping down the boards. I had nailed in place myself, their faces cold, their movements methodical, almost military. My heart sank as I realized that they weren't just enforcing rules, they were deliberately trying to provoke me, to make me powerless, to take control of my land. I tried talking to them. I begged them to stop. I reminded them the fence was on my property, that I had followed every regulation, that nothing I did was illegal. They ignored me. One of them even smiled as they heaved another plank off the posts, tossing it onto the ground like it was trash. The sound of splintering wood echoed across my yard, mingling with my anger and disbelief. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. My fence wasn't just a boundary, it was protection. It was my line between chaos and safety, and now it was gone. Once the fence was down, I walked through the yard, surveying the damage. I noticed the gate hanging on one hinge, the posts uprooted, the metal brackets bent and twisted. It wasn't just vandalism, it was strategic. They wanted the wildlife to have free access, to test my patience and my resilience. I didn't yet know just how right I was about that. I returned to my house, my mind racing, and tried to plan my next move. Calling the HOA office seemed futile. They never answered. And when they did, they spoke in riddles, citing regulations that didn't exist, making threats I didn't have to obey. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the gap where the fence had been, and I remembered my neighbor mentioning that wild boars had been seen near the property recently, and a bear had been spotted wandering further up the hills. I laughed nervously at the thought. Could they possibly wander down into the neighborhood? My laughter died quickly the next morning, because when I stepped outside the following day, I realized this wasn't just about my fence anymore. The wildlife had found their way through the gap, and the chaos that would follow wasn't even my fault. The morning after the fence was torn down, I stepped outside and immediately noticed the signs of intrusion. Footprints, deep, muddy, clawed tracks that didn't belong to any deer or dog I'd ever seen. The smell hit me next, pungent, wild, the unmistakable scent of animals that had no fear. My heart sank. I had read warnings about wild boars and the occasional wandering bear in the area, but I had never imagined they could come this close, let alone through my yard. The gap left by the HOA wasn't just a breach in property, it was an invitation. I grabbed my phone to document the tracks, my camera capturing every detail. The boars had uprooted small garden patches, dug near the flower beds, and left clumps of dirt scattered across the lawn. I could hear the distant rustle of leaves and the snapping of branches. At first, I hoped it was just one animal, curious and alone. But soon more signs appeared, broken branches bent downward, deep scratches along the trunks of young trees. My stomach twisted. These were no ordinary intrusions. Then I saw the first glimpse of the bear. Its massive form loomed over the edge of the property, foraging calmly as though it owned the place. It moved with surprising grace for its size, sniffing and pawing at the ground where the fence had once kept it out. My adrenaline spiked. I retreated indoors, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the chaos that had been unleashed. The animals weren't just wandering. They were systematically exploring, testing every boundary, marking the land as their own. And with each passing hour, the damage grew. I checked the neighboring properties. Some had minor damage, upturned flower beds, bent garden furniture, but others weren't so lucky. One neighbor's shed had a partially collapsed roof, apparently the result of the boars' relentless digging combined with the bear's curious weight. Trees that had stood for decades now bore deep claw marks, splintered and scarred. The neighborhood was in shock. People were running around trying to protect their property, yelling, banging pots, but nothing could stop it. And then it hit me. This was exactly the moment the HOA had been trying to provoke. They thought they could intimidate me by destroying my fence, not realizing that their action had triggered a far greater force. Their so-called rules had created an opening for nature itself to retaliate. I felt a mix of awe and disbelief. There was something almost poetic about the chaos unfolding, a reminder that you cannot control everything, and that attempts to dominate others, even landowners, can backfire spectacularly. By late afternoon, the boars had dug trenches nearly 10 feet long. The bear had toppled small structures, and my property and the neighborhood was in shambles. And all of it started with a simple fence that should never have been torn down. By the third day, the full scale of the destruction became painfully clear. I stepped outside early in the morning, expecting some minor damage from the wild animals, but what I saw made my heart sink. My yard was a war zone. Uprooted garden beds, mangled shrubs, and the remnants of what had once been a carefully maintained lawn. The boars had dug deep trenches along the property line, and the bears' massive paw prints left dark impressions in the soil, cutting across the grass like a warning. It wasn't just my land, it was spilling into my neighbors' yards, and their panic was palpable. Neighbors were running in all directions, trying to protect their pets and belongings. One elderly couple waved sticks, shouting at the boars that were trampling their vegetable patch. Another family huddled in their porch, watching as the bear approached the small barn behind their house. Cars honked in confusion, and dogs barked uncontrollably. The entire street was filled with tension, fear, and disbelief. People whispered rumors about what had caused this sudden surge in wildlife activity, but no one could piece it together. Everyone assumed it was a natural disaster, but no one guessed that human meddling had opened the door. I tried to organize some control. I set up temporary barriers with whatever materials I could find, hoping to keep the animals from wandering further. It was futile. The boars were relentless, rooting and charging through everything in their path. The bear, massive and unbothered, wandered calmly among the chaos, its curiosity overriding any fear. It struck me that these animals had no concept of property lines, no HOA regulations to follow. They were free, wild, and unstoppable. Meanwhile, the HOA sent out an email to the neighborhood, claiming they were reviewing the situation and vaguely warning residents to exercise caution. Their words were hollow, almost comical, considering their direct role in allowing this disaster to unfold. I realized the HOA never considered consequences beyond their narrow enforcement of petty rules. They had created an environment where wildlife could wreak havoc, and now everyone was paying the price. By late afternoon, the sound of crashing trees, snapping branches, and shouting neighbors filled the air. Families tried to rescue garden furniture, small animals, and even vehicles in some cases. I watched from the edge of my property, realizing this wasn't just a story about my fence anymore. It was a story about hubris, both human and institutional, colliding with nature. The animals didn't care about property, regulations, or fines. They were simply taking advantage of the opportunity presented to them. As the sun began to set, I couldn't help but feel a mix of dread and satisfaction. The HOA had set this chain of events into motion. Now, the fallout was indiscriminate, powerful, and unavoidable. After 3 days of chaos, my patience with the HOA had worn thin. Their petty enforcement had triggered this disaster, and now I was determined to hold them accountable. I drove to their office, a small building tucked behind manicured hedges, clutching photographs and videos of the destruction. Every board member who had approved the fence removal had to see the consequences of their actions. The uprooted gardens, the clawed trees, the neighbors' destroyed sheds. I walked in, trying to remain calm, but the receptionist gave me a polite yet suspicious look. I explained my purpose, to speak to the HOA board about the fence they tore down and the wildlife destruction that followed. After what felt like an eternity, they allowed me into a small conference room where 4 board members were seated. Their faces were carefully neutral, but I could see hints of tension when I laid out my evidence. I opened my laptop and projected the images onto the wall. The board members leaned forward, frowning. There were videos of wild boars digging trenches, trees splintered by the bear's claws, and a neighbor's shed half collapsed. I described each scene with precise detail, emphasizing that the destruction began only after the fence was removed by their order. Your actions directly caused this, I said, my voice steady but firm. This isn't just about my property. It's about everyone's safety and their homes. One member attempted to downplay it, claiming we were only enforcing regulations. We couldn't predict wildlife would act like this. I shook my head. You didn't just fail to predict. You created the conditions. That fence was the only barrier protecting the neighborhood. Now look at the damage. I could see a flicker of unease. Their composed, corporate demeanors were cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. I continued, highlighting the human element. Scared neighbors, pets running loose, the financial loss of gardens, fencing, and structures. How would you feel if this happened to your property? I asked. Silence followed. For the first time, the board seemed genuinely aware that this was more than paperwork or rules. It was real-life consequences. By the end of the meeting, they agreed to send a formal apology and cover certain damages, though grudgingly. Still, I knew this was only a partial victory. The neighborhood and my property had already suffered, and no amount of compensation could erase the memory of the chaos. But standing there, looking the HOA board in the eyes, I felt a surge of empowerment. I realized that speaking truth to authority even in the face of bureaucracy, could force accountability. That evening, I returned to my yard, surveying the ongoing wildlife havoc. Though the HOA had been confronted, the animals continued their exploration, undeterred by rules, fines, or apologies. Nature, it seemed, had its own reckoning. By the fifth day, the neighborhood had settled into a tense rhythm, but the chaos continued on my property. The wild boars had expanded their roots, leaving deep trenches and mangled flower beds, while the bear wandered freely, knocking over small sheds and upending compost bins. It was clear that this was no random act of nature. It was a reckoning. The fence the HOA tore down had been more than just a boundary. It was a line holding back the wild, and now the consequences were indisputable. I walked through the property with my camera, documenting the destruction. Fallen branches littered the yard. Uprooted plants created muddy chaos, and my carefully arranged garden was completely destroyed. Neighboring yards bore similar scars. Some residents were frantic, trying to repair fences or corral pets, while others simply watched, paralyzed by the enormity of what had unfolded. It was surreal to witness the aftermath. This wasn't merely a property dispute anymore. It was a collision between human arrogance and nature's power. As I reviewed the footage, I noticed something remarkable. The homes closest to the original fence line, the areas where the HOA had aggressively enforced their rules, had suffered the most damage. It was as if the boars and bear had targeted the very places where human intervention had been most forceful. The irony was unmistakable. The HOA's attempt to assert control had opened the door for destruction, and now nature had taken its own revenge. Some neighbors tried to blame the animals entirely, but I knew the truth. The HOA had underestimated both the wildlife and the consequences of removing that fence. The animals were simply exploiting an opportunity they never would have had. There was a strange sense of poetic justice in it, even amid the chaos. While the neighborhood scrambled to repair the damage, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the system that had tried to dominate us had been humbled, not by confrontation, but by the forces they couldn't control. By evening, I stood near what remained of my garden, watching the sun cast long shadows over the trenches, overturned sheds, and claw-marked trees. I knew repairs would take weeks, maybe months, but the lesson was clear. Nature does not bend to human bureaucracy, and actions have consequences, often greater than imagined. The HOA had learned, the neighborhood had learned, and so had I. In the weeks that followed, the HOA reluctantly paid for some repairs, but the real victory wasn't financial. It was the understanding that trying to control people and land without foresight can backfire spectacularly. My fence and the chaos unleashed had proven that power can shift quickly, and sometimes nature enforces justice far better than any rule or regulation ever could.